but we thought we'd take this opportunity to give everyone a little bit of a preview of one of the winter shows and to talk a little bit about printmaking techniques, because it's called Out of the Shadows is one of the shows that we're putting on this winter, and it's all prints from our permanent collection. And so we're really lucky to be able to have such a rich collection of prints in many different media from many different time periods, and they don't get out much. So it's very exciting to be able to have this coming up. And so that's why we're going to spend some time today talking about different printmaking techniques. And I hope that you find it interesting, because I find it very interesting. And I hope that you can learn some little tricks and tells today that you can take to other museums when you're visiting them, or to future exhibits that display prints.
Kevin, so when you say they don't get out very often, is that only because sensitivity to light? Are there any other factors?
Yeah.
That's it.
I mean, prints are small, usually, so they often, bigger works that have more like immediate wow factor sometimes get out a little bit more. But primarily it's because of light sensitivity. Paper and ink are some of the most light sensitive media that are used in fine arts. So this list is going to be really big and scary, but don't panic. So there's a list on the left of different types and different categories of prints. The three main categories are relief printing, intaglio, and planographic processes. Relief printing is when you have the block and you carve into it, and what is on top is what prints the lines. Intaglio, it comes from the Italian word to cut into, intagliare, and it's when you cut into the plate and you put the ink inside of those lines, and so the cut into portions are what prints onto the paper. And planographic processes are flat. So lithograph being the primary example of that. And the ones that are highlighted in red are the ones that we'll spend the most time talking about, because they are the most common in fine art printmaking. So a lot of these other ones are very technical, and they're like small little differences between the processes. So it's a little bit less of a, if you want to focus on some, we're going to focus on the ones in the red. But if you do have questions about any of these ones that we'll come to, we can definitely do that. We can talk about them. Also, I'll say that all the prints that you see by themselves here are prints from our collection that are going to be in the show. So it will say NMWA on it, so you'll know that as well. But that's the preview element of this presentation as well. So the things we can think about when we're looking at prints and thinking about printmaking is the material, the materials that are used to make the print. As printmaking technology developed, the different and less expensive and easier ways to make prints were discovered, and so that is what primarily drove the development of new printmaking techniques. Whether and how much expertise is required, whether an artist was able to do the whole process themselves, or whether they required an expert printmaker to send their design to have it be printed. That was very, very common historically, and in all of these processes, and still is in a lot of ways. The ease and speed of production, similar to the cost of materials. And then when we're looking at a print, some of the things that will help us determine what kind of print it is what the line looks like, especially the ends of the line, the edge quality of the outside of the design, which in some cases is called a plate mark. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the use of color. Some of these processes, most of these processes are easiest in black and white or a single color. And so the addition of color, multiple layers of color, fields of color later is an important part of what makes the print process more complicated. So we can talk about that as Okay. And I'm gonna try to keep an eye on time because I know that we have lunch. Yeah. So monotype is the simplest, easiest type of print to understand. Mono means one, and so a monotype is a print where you just have one. You draw, you paint, you design in ink on a plate, and then you put the paper on top, and that's it. Sometimes you can get another pull, but really it's a one-shot deal. So artists like Degas is known to have done this. This is something that big famous artists do. But because you can only get one print, it is harder to make that a big part of your artistic practice because you can only do one. We have a monotype that's going to be in the show. This is creates a lot of strong feelings. This particular one, some people love it, some people don't love it. It is I don't know how to say Yotaku print. It's a type of Japanese printmaking where you paint on a fish and then put the paper on top and pull it off. So originally it was used to record the sizes of a fisherman's catch, from what I have researched. And so we do have one.
Paint actually on the fish?
You put paint on the fish because then you can wash it off and you can still sell the fish, right? So you have proof that you caught this really big fish, but you can still make money off the fish and eat it yourself or whatever you want. So you see these a lot in Japanese restaurants, even today sushi restaurants, a lot of them have these prints. This is a pretty recent one by an artist who lives in Hawaii. And you can see the wrinkling of the paper. In some cases, that would be a big cause for concern in terms of the condition of a print. But this is on Japanese paper, Japan paper, rice paper, all kind of, for all intents and purposes, interchangeable. It's really, really thin. So when you introduce the wet ink to this very, very thin paper, it often causes it to wrinkle like this. So if we had this much wrinkling in another print, we might send it for conservation, but this one we're not as worried about because it's part of the process and it tells part of the story of the print. So woodblock, these are some of the tools that are used for woodblock printing. Woodblock printing or woodcuts were a process that was developed in China in around the 7th to 9th century, and then made their way along the Silk Road to Europe that way. In Europe, printmaking started by printing with wood blocks on fabric, which is still something that's done in a lot of places today. And so you carve into the flat surface of the wood. The grain of the wood is this way, and that will become significant in a moment. And then, as we were saying, the raised lines that are left are the lines that are printed on the page. So often you'll use a baren to smooth out. Once you put the paper on the block, you use something flat and smooth to sort of make sure all the ink gets rubbed in evenly. And sort of later, that's what the printing press evolved to do, is to apply even pressure across and spread out the ink that way. So here's another example that's not in our collection, but this shows that if you are going to print with a woodblock in multiple colors, you need to carve multiple blocks, and you need to make sure when you're doing the printing that they're all lined up really precisely, or else you'll sort of see sometimes these overlapping color fields just sort of sneaking out into different, where they're maybe coloring outside the lines a little bit. This is one of the examples that we'll have from our collection in the show. It's a 16th century stag hunt with hounds, and it's pretty small. So as printmaking arrives in Europe, and before people are getting into these bigger, sizes. It's a specialized skill set for a really long time, and artists would do the drawing and then often send it to a printmaker or a wood carver to carve the block, and then it would be printed by a printmaker. So I think coming up, that's fine, I'll trust myself here. So this is an example of a color wood block, color wood cut that we have. That is an example, a really complicated, and when you spend some time looking at it, you can see, where are the different color blocks. You can sort of think about how many different blocks were maybe used in the production of this particular print. Like you can see the red would have just had like 4 or 5 dots of wood that were sticking up. But it really makes a huge impact, right? Okay, that will come later. Lino cuts are basically a modern version of wood blocks because it's a modern material. Functionally, it's all the same as a wood block. You take the linoleum, you carve into it, and the raised part is what you print off of. When you are comparing a lino cut to a wood block, you'll notice that because the plastic has such precise edges, it's not the natural edge of the wood on the lines, right? On the paper it gives this really kind of doughy, wet looking line, if that makes sense. So these, you really get the darkness of the ink, a very saturated, because of the quality of the material that it's made in. I think I have some comparisons coming up. But these are some of the linos that will be in the show. You can really see the way that the quality of these carved lines sort of leaves sometimes these little black peaks. And this artist, Campbell, has used that really effectively to create these effects, especially in the clouds. You can see that, those really juicy, I don't know why juicy is the word that comes to mind here. And in the log as well, those really rich blacks.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
How important is the paper that it's printed on? Because I imagine they learn differently.
Yeah, that's a huge, it makes a huge difference, absolutely. As finer papers developed in Europe during the Renaissance and early modern period, you can get a lot finer lines. Another really interesting thing with printmaking, especially with etching and engravings, is that often the paper is wet or dampened before it's printed, and what that helps to do is pull the ink into the paper. So it's using gravity, pressure, and also like moisture to pull the ink into the paper. So here's a comparison of the two, and I think, no. So another difference with the line quality you can see in the end of the lines. Both of these processes, well, especially with a woodcut, when you're carving a line and you're carving away from it, what you end up with at the end of the line that's left is a very round end. So I have a detail later, I'm absolutely sure of it. But when you see the ends of these lines, you can see that they all end in these sort of U shapes. Because you're removing, it's harder to create a real point with a woodcut because you're removing around it. And if you had created a really sharp point in a woodcut, it would pretty easily wear over time, right? The more times you press it, the amount of pressure you're putting on it, wood wears down fairly quickly. The linoleum has a bit of a sharper edge, which I think is what creates these really rich fields of color. And when we're comparing line work, like this woodcut and some of the ones we're going to see next, that's how you can tell the difference often if you're looking really closely at the lines.
So I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So on the one on the right, it clearly says woodcut on paper.
Mhm.
The one on the left, it just says ink on paper. Does it ever say lino print?
And that's a great question. So I think sometimes when art is coming into the collection, either the people who are giving it or the people who are accessioning it maybe don't know the distinctions with prints. And so this says ink on paper because we know for sure it's ink on paper.
Right.
That's document, like everyone with eyes can see that part. I am very certain this is lino, because of all those reasons.
Yeah.
And throughout this researching process of preparing the show, Tammy and I have found a number of prints that are listed in these sort of vague ways,
Okay.
and we will be
Adding more info.
we will be adding more information and correcting what is. I saw one that was listed as etching on vellum, and I went to look at it, and I went, "That's not vellum, that's paper." So we'll be updating and correcting, and I think it is a great question, and I really appreciate it because I think it's a good reminder that nobody's perfect, and we're still learning about the collection, and we're still making sure to update.
And the average person probably wouldn't care, but I'm interested in printmaking, so I always want to know.
Mhm.
You know?
Stone cut we'll touch on really briefly, because this isn't our image, but this is we have a copy of this print that will be in the show. Stone cut was developed in Inuit communities in the mid 20th century because carving stone was a process that was part of their cultural tradition. And when printmaking was introduced by visitors to Inuit cultures, it was something they adapted very quickly to their own cultural background. So they started to carve just like a wood block, same process, everything, but carving with stone. And this is still sometimes done, but it wasn't fully. It didn't really take off because it's a much more specialized skill that requires these carvers. It's a very expensive material that has to be brought great distances to the communities, and then you can't really reuse it. Once the full edition is printed, they would either destroy the block or scrape off the top layer so they could start another print. But that's reusing the materials, right? And it is really cool to have this new type of printmaking that developed from their own cultural traditions. Okay, engraving. So this is another one of the big 5. Engraving is one of the intaglio processes where you take usually a copper plate, that's pretty traditional, and carve into it with some of these sharp tools. And these are the things that these are more of we're getting into the style of prints that really use printing presses. So they developed after the invention of the printing press, which was in 1450 about. I'll point out to everyone too that the Met has a really great series about the different major printmaking techniques, and there are videos and photos along the way that you can follow. So if you are going to give tours about this and want a little bit more info, that might be a great resource, or to point people to. This is also what I was talking about with the plate mark. So because you are carving onto a plate and then pressing the paper onto the plate, the paper goes around the plate, right, when you're pushing down on it. So it creates this impression of the plate that shows the edges. So sometimes the design goes all the way to the edge of the plate. Often it doesn't. And a lot of times in history, if prints were made on these really big papers with really small plates, collectors would trim. They call it trimming to the plate mark. So they'll trim to about here so you can see paper plate mark image.
So is there an indentation where the print is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can, you have to look really closely and be really close to the print. but you can see that sort of indent, whereas with a wood block, it's less, it's not going to be that perfect impression. Yeah.
Would you use that spatula to put the paint on? Is that what that's for?
So yes, so you would carve the lines, and then you would put the ink onto the plate with the little spatula thing, and then spread it all around, and then you wipe the plate clean so that the ink is only in the indentations, right? So, but you can still, usually you can still see a little bit of residue, right, from the ink. So there, if you're a print collector or something and buying different prints, you can look at how good the impression is, like how dark the darks are, and you can look at how clean the plate was. There are lots of factors that would figure into things like value, or whether it's a really good version of the print or not. So,
How about if it's crooked like that one is? It's trying to be nice.
well, if you trim it to the plate mark, you can't tell that it was printed crooked. But that's a good point. Yeah.
How hard is it to carve into the copper? You're doing that with your bare hands.
That's a really good point. Okay, so this is where we get into the like specialized skills, right? So engraving like this is a very specialized skill. It developed out of the tradition of goldsmithing, jewelry making, armor making. So it's not something that just every artist is going to be able to do. So again, often, you know, you could have artists who are really good at engraving, but you could have a drawing that you bring to a printmaker and they do the preparation and the printmaking. So that's all, that kind of like breaks down the process into more
And
steps.
copper is fairly soft, so you can, with a sharp tool and just the power of your hand, engrave lines into it.
So, and in terms of printing multiple copies, these metal prints are much stronger than wood, right? So you can make a lot more copies, which is part of what sparked the Reformation and the Renaissance, that all of a sudden you can get all of these images and text out to a whole bunch of people. Later they will start doing steel-faced copper plates, which is even stronger. That's like 1800s. So they're just constantly developing new ways to make more copies, because then you sell more and you spread your artistic reputation, your image, your whatever message you're trying to send. Yeah, Lori?
Well, so then that kind of went along with bookmaking and how books, because I remember when we had a Rungus print, it was like, you know, maybe somebody can't afford it, but they can afford it. He did a lot of dry pouring.
Yeah. Well, that's yeah. It's very much printmaking was very democratizing for fine arts because it was so much less expensive, so much more accessible, so much more portable even, that just so many more people can have access to these texts and images than would otherwise be able to. Ooh, everyone, ooh, Durr. This is a huge deal. Durr is one of the artists who changed printmaking and art forever. He did woodcuts. He started off doing woodcuts in the late, 1450s, 90s. And also we have some engravings from him. He was the one, he started making them big. And instead of having these small images with text, we have these big images that you can just have the image. So there's tons of detail. Scholars are still, not entirely 100% sure whether he's carving his own plates or whether he's working with a printmaker. But his works changed the face of printmaking in European art forever. So this is so exciting, very great, big deal. So finally, here's my comparison of the, I wish I could get a little closer on St. Jerome, but you can sort of see how all of these lines are ending in these curved, blunt ends, and the engraved lines are ending in these kind of sharp points. And that's because when you're making a line in a metal plate, when you pick up your tool, it sort of comes up out of the metal, right? It sort of like swoops up a little bit. So there's less ink in that spot. It's a sharp point and there's less ink. So on the page, it also reads as a kind of pointy line. Here's another engraving that we have from this period that's really exciting and very, very detailed, very, very intricate. And another thing I want to highlight is the use of engraving in more recent history and everyday life, right? We're going to have this print, this $10 bill in the show. It's an engraving. Here's another one where I added in engraving because we'll add that to the record. But money is printed, or historically was printed as an engraving because it's a very strong process that you can repeat a lot of times and still have a good impression at the end of it. So this is something that we use in everyday life that is a type of print, and that we sometimes forget about it being part of our lives in this way. So yeah.
Do you know what type of printmaking approach Audubon used in producing bird prints?
Yes, he is coming up.
Okay.
He used both lithographs and engravings. Lithographs being very popular in the 19th century. That's when they were invented, in the 19th century, because it was another quicker, cheaper, faster, you can make more prints type of printmaking. So a lot of his are that. Here's something that gets, this one can sometimes trick people. I'll try not to dwell too long on this. Wood engraving is really a type of woodcut. It's not a type of engraving. You are carving away the bits that you want to appear white on your print. But it is the end grain of the wood and the heartwood of the tree, and not just the side. So because of that, because it's harder, stronger wood, you can get a lot more detail than if you're carving on this side of the wood with the long grain. So because of that, wood engravings are often a lot smaller than other types of woodcuts, and you do sort of get this, it's a lot more black heavy because it's more work to carve away more white, so you're left with more black. So that's a thing that you can kind of help keep in mind when you're looking at a wood block or a wood engraving. Here's a really good example. So this is one that's going to be in the show, Agnes Miller Parker, and you can see how the design sort of bleeds into the edges, right? The edges are black, and what is carved out is the white. So you don't get that. You sort of get the square of the whole print, or the whole block, if it is a square, but because it is, that part would all be inked, you're getting the black on the edges.
So why is one called wood engraving and the other called wood block? Because they're essentially the same the way you're describing them.
I think there needs to be a way to like all these processes are so similar that there needs to be a way to differentiate the process a bit.
So the difference is that it's the end grain of the wood.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the biggest difference, is that it's the end grain. And you get this more black. It's a little bit more atmospheric. It can look a little bit more like an etching or a mezzo or something. So it looks a little bit more like a engraving or an etching or something like that, but it is a wood process. So, dry point really quickly. Dry point is just you take the plate and you carve into it with a sharp tool, like Jane was saying. So what that does is creates both the indentation of the line and these two little spurs on the outside that also hold ink. And so it's it can be a fast process that the artist can do themselves, but because the richness of the print depends on these burrs, it's not as stable of a process. The first few dry points that you pull, you get this really rich fuzzy line because that's the ink that's trapped in those little side burrs. But as you pull more and more, those get worn down really quickly. So I have an example. This is not in the show. This is not one of ours. But also a lot of these processes are often combined and used together. So this is an engraved etching and dry point, but you can see that the earlier version has so many more rich fuzzy darks, and then the later version you see more of those deep straight lines, and that is the result of the dry point lines being worn away to produce these more just like line drawing type of prints. So we do have some Rungus dry points that will be in the show. And the plan is also to show these together because they show a kind of important step-by-step process in the printmaking, or the step-by-step process of printmaking, in that we call them different proofs or different states. An artist will, especially with a dry point or something where they're working directly on the plate, do a little work, put some ink on it, pull a piece of paper, see what it looks like, and be like, oh, I need to shade that in more. So we actually have 3 states of this one print, and you can see that Rungus is adding shading throughout, sometimes smoothing some things out, but the finished print is this one. So you can see his sort of thought process and development of the piece.
I'm confused, which is not abnormal. But anyway, I don't understand the difference between dry point and wood cuts.
Okay.
I mean, is one you're dabbing in ink and the other one you're putting ink on the paper and then you're doing something?
So dry point is the same as engraving in that you're making a line into the plate and putting the ink in there. So the ink is inside the plate, and that's the lines you see on the paper. Whereas with the wood block, you are carving, and the wood engraving, you are carving away and leaving the raised portions, and that's the part that you ink, that's the part that you see when you pull the plate. Does that make sense? Kind of. So all the metal ones you're carving in and the ink goes in. And the wood ones you're carving away and the ink goes on the top. That's
Dry point's on metal. Dry point's always on metal.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
So, and these are all types of intaglio processes that we're talking about now, apart from the woods.
What does intaglio mean?
Intagliare is to cut into. So. Etching is the last big one of the intaglio processes. Similarly to engraving, you start with a plate, then you coat it with a resin, and you draw into the resin. So in terms of materials, it's the same, pretty much the same materials in terms of cost to the artist, but it's a lot easier for an artist to produce this because you can take your plate with your resin on it, and you don't have to carve into anything. You can just draw. Like, it's a lot easier than a dry point. It's a lot easier than anything. So once you do your drawing, you'll see the plate will look something like this on top. And so the parts where you've drawn will be exposed to the metal. And then the printmaker, who's sometimes different than the artist, puts that metal plate into an acid bath, and the acid eats away where the metal is exposed, but not where the metal is covered with the resin. So it's the acid that's doing the hard work of making the print, not the artist. And so this allows a lot of freedom for artists when it's developed, mid 17th century, something like that. The feather's kind of fun because when it's in the acid bath, you can't have bubbles develop on the surface of the plate or else they'll eat deeper into the plate. So they would have apprentices whose job it was to go around with the feathers and brush all the bubbles off of the plates while they were being bathed. So here's another one you can, thank you. This is a print from our collection, an etching that will be in the show. And you can really see the difference here in the line quality from this and the other mediums. It's so much more free. It's like the artist is sketching. Like they could take these plates and go to the zoo they could do it at home. It doesn't have to be this, I'm in my studio with all my tools kind of thing. It's much more free. And so you see the lines kind of sketched out, jumping all over the place. And that's what allows them to do that is the freedom of this process where it's the acid that's eating into the print. So these are the comparisons of what we've looked at so far. The end of the lines of an etching are a little bit more like a wood block. So that's how you can tell the difference. Otherwise, it's very difficult sometimes to tell between an engraving and an etching. But because the acid eats in to the metal sort of evenly, it's going to create a shape that's more rounded at the end of these lines than the engraver who is creating these sharp points. And the same from a profile perspective, engraving will create these trenches like a V, and etching creates these more deep, smoothed out lines. So trying to keep an eye on time here. Here's another etching that will be in the show, just to kind of highlight, prints don't have to be black and white. This is a red-brown ink, which I'm sure was chosen to mimic the sort of Conte crayon that a lot of artists were sketching, those sort of like red drawings. I think we have a lot of Kuhn drawings like that. So the artist can choose their colors. Mezzotint. Okay. A mezzotint is developed sort of, I'm looking at my cheat sheet here. About the late 1650s, it sort of takes off in the 1700s and 1800s. Before anything design-wise happens to the plate, the artist will take a rocker like this and create a field of like dots basically over the whole plate. And so if you printed the plate just like that, it would come out black because the ink would go into all those little holes and then it would come onto the paper. But then to make the design, the artist will go in with a smoothing tool and smooth out portions. And what this allows the artist to do is if it's a pure mezzotint, there are no solid lines in a mezzotint because it's all of this shading and smoothing, right? So it allows a much more painterly kind of play with dark and light, which again was 1700s, very big on the light and dark thing, and it really lets you get these deep dark blacks and these really light whites, often used in conjunction with other printmaking techniques, especially engraving, because it's so surface. You're not carving a hunk out of the plate. The plate deteriorates a lot faster than like engraving. So they would use engraved lines to strengthen the design, and then the mezzotint to produce shading, which we have an example. So this is the black and white version. We have a colored version, which is very exciting. but I wanted to show you the black and white to give you a sense that of the texture of the mezzotint, the way it's sort of kind of atmospheric up here. There are these sort of natural looking lights and darks. Here's our version. Oh, no, not yet. And in the background of all of these prints, there are etched lines as well. So the rigging on the back of the ships and behind the scene are these really fine lines. And so we know that's not a mezzotint, but it creates these really delicate, but much stronger lines than would otherwise be achievable. Here's our version. It's very exciting and great. And I'm gonna resist every temptation to talk just about this for the next 10 minutes. But it's really great. It's fabulous. It's a really exciting print to have. Two again. Here's another mezzotint that we have in the show, just to show kind of the history of this medium, that it was being used as far back as 1680s. This one also, you get a bit more of the sense of that like unevenness. Often the plates would be rocked. I forget what the term is, but the plates would be prepared by an apprentice again, and then the master would come in and actually do the design. So maybe the apprentice wasn't as practiced at making even backgrounds yet, or this was the effect they were going for. That's also a possibility. But
Candace, did most of the artists have a painting done and then kind of go, oh, I'm gonna do it in a print? Or did they go, I'm just gonna go do a print? Or
yeah, that depends a great deal on the artist and the time period. There were artists who worked primarily in print. So like we know Dürer painted, but he's known primarily for his printmaking, partially because he was so revolutionary. Rembrandt, we know Rembrandt painted. We have, let's say 50, whatever. There are a very limited number of Rembrandt paintings, but we really know his work through his printmaking, because you can be so much more prolific with printmaking. So in that time, it did become kind of popular you could either do projects that were for print, or if you did a painting that you wanted to popularize, spread around quite a lot, you could have it be made as a print. And that's what happened with Copley here. It was a painting, two versions of the painting, and then when the subject of the painting decided he wanted to run for political office, he thought, I know, I'll have my most heroic moment made into a print and sold all around the world. And then he got elected. So it works. So it does depend. It depends on the situation. Yeah. Okay. So aqua tint. We might come back to aqua tint because I want to make sure we get to screen prints, which are the last of the really important big ones. But we can come back to this if people are interested. This will be in the show from our collection. It's really great, very cute. We have a bunch of Picassos that are listed as sugar lifts, and so I had to figure out what a sugar lift is. It's not very common, but we will have those in the show as well. Lithographs. Oh, we have to do lithographs too. Okay, this will be. So lithographs were invented in the early 1800s and really changed the game in terms of printmaking. It's a planographic process, which means it's flat, and you can maybe tell by the roots of the word lithograph that it's a print that's made on stone instead of on metal. And in a very basic sense, the artist will draw directly on the stone and then kind of seal the drawing in there. And then, because what they're drawing in is an oily substance like a crayon or an oil-based ink, oil-based pigment, later when they go to print that stone, they wet the surface of the stone and then put the ink on, and the ink for the printing will only stick to the oily ink of the drawing and not to the wet surface of the stone. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So the advantages of this process was that you could make, stone is so strong, you could make thousands of prints, whereas with metal plates you can make hundreds. And it's a very, at first the stones were only coming from a particular area in Germany. Then they found ways to do this with cheaper metals like zinc and aluminum. So it's a very cheap method, and you can make tons and tons and tons of different versions, or different of pulls. So we have a pair of a stone and print that we will be showing together in the show, which is pretty cool. So this is the stone that was used to produce the print, and then the print itself. So you can see how, I should have put them together, but you can see how also an advantage of lithography is that you can get really rich darks over a pretty significant field. So you can get these really subtle differentiations of color. You don't need a specialist to carve it or to print it. Really, you just sponge and ink. Yeah, it's very efficient. So again, oh, this is a fun one. So this is not coming to the show. We don't have this one, but whenever I think of lithographs and the oily material, this is an artist who made a print using lipstick. So she was kissing the stone, and then the marks of her lips were what was pulled in the finished print. So that's very cool. In terms of identifying lithographs, the lines that you get are often the same quality of line as the materials that you're using. So like a crayon has those sort of crumbly edges, or a grease pencil, or even lipstick, that the mark isn't this perfect straight line. You get these sort of rough edges to the line, right? And also that you can have these really subtle gradations of color that are harder to achieve in other media. So a nice, easy way is that if the image sort of like fades off into nothingness, it's usually a lithograph. That's usually a good tell. You're not seeing a plate mark, you're not seeing a border. It just sort of, it can just disappear. And here's a close-up of some of those lines that gives you a sense of how directly the quality translates to the finished print. Lithography was really important for newspapers and illustrations, and it was a huge use for it in the 19th and 20th century as the sort of the scope of our world was expanding. Being able to print newspapers and get newspapers from other places really helped spread culture around the world. And map making was another example of things, practical uses that lithography was used for. Okay, last one, I promise. So a silk screen is usually associated with the second half of the 20th century, but the technique developed in the 19th century. It was imported from Japan and Asia into Western Europe in the late 1800s, when all of Japanese was everything Oriental and Japanese was so popular in Europe at that time. And then throughout the course of the 19th century, as new photochemical processes were being developed, that's really what kicked off screen printing and made it possible to do in large scale. So the simplest form of a screen print is that you can either do a stencil and then push the ink through the screen onto your paper, or you can take the screen and paint around it, block out the design, and then push it through as well. Now I put this up as an example of how kind of more complicated things can get with those photochemical processes, that you put the design onto like some sort of gel, and then the gel hardens, and then you use light, and then the light just makes the design part of the gel disappear, and then that's what you use. So the more complicated version is what is really being employed in the 20th century to make posters and advertising and labels for things. And that's how we get it into fine art use, because it was Andy Warhol who decided to take this process that was used for advertising, basically, and printing labels, to use it as a fine art medium. So we're putting all the Warhols up. They'll be out, and that will be really exciting and great. Nice colorful addition to our show. In terms of color, whereas most of the previous processes are done in one color ink, and then you can apply color later. The screen print, you can, like a woodblock print, you can make multiple screens for different parts of the design, and then you lay them on top of each other. So screen prints are often very colorful, but the way that you can tell it's a screen print often is those colors sort of lay on top of each other in these big, really thick layers of color, and at the edges, it's very thick and clear that this is where the color is, this is not. So you can look especially at these like joins of the red and this blue, the yellow. You can see these really saturated colors laying on top of each other. The other thing that can be done with the silk screen, here's a close up. If you're using those photochemical processes to dissolve different parts of the design at different rates, you can get these sort of like pixelated, spotty layers that wouldn't be possible in other media. And then you can also use multiple colors of ink on a single screen. So with this piece, I'm pretty sure that the line work is all one screen. And then this part of the line work had a white ink smeared on it, and then yellow, and then green, and then the artist or an assistant would push the ink this way, so that you get these sort of blendings of color here from yellow to white to yellow, and then from yellow to green. Okay. I think that is time. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Sorry.
Each of those techniques will be a different gallery or a different section of the gallery. Is that how you're doing?
We are probably not. We're planning to arrange the works more based on kind of what the animals are doing in the prints.
Oh.
So like political images versus religious images, or allegorical images, or conservation and like activism. So that is sort of the current plan. We haven't fully nailed down all of those categories yet, but that's yeah.
What approach did Audubon use?
Oh, sorry. Thank you for. I had this sort of little quiz that we could have done to be like, what kind of print is this? The Audubons are here, so. Yeah, but I didn't do this. So anyway, so this one is a lithograph, because you can see how would have been a hand-colored probably lithograph, because design doesn't meet the edge of the paper, right? It just sort of disappears, right? And that's a telltale sign of a lithograph. Up close, you can look at the line quality a little bit better, but the real big red flag for that is the fact that the image itself doesn't go to the edge of the plate or the page. This one was an etching and an aqua tint, I believe. So it goes all the way, again, both hand colored. So this is a little bit of a hard one because the color is applied after and painted on. So it sort of masks a little bit of what you might be looking for in terms of plate mark and line quality and all those things. But yes, he used all of those processes.
I have some questions. So just because this is an exhibit on prints, is every single work going to be behind glass?
Yes.
And then, I mean, so like the Warhols are in our collection. We bring them out every 3 or 5 years or whatever. Do they get a different frame, like each time they go out? Because I'm assuming when you store them, you don't store them inside the frames, right?
We do. Most of these are actually stored in the frames because it protects the print and the paper and keeps it from rubbing up against things, or then we can store them upright as opposed to having flat, which is a little bit more space.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Takes
So-
up less space.
Takes up less. Thank you. And they will all be framed with glass because of the light concerns. For added protection, for future storage. We haven't, to my knowledge, reframed the Warhols.
Okay.
We're concentrating on some of these works. We have about 13 pieces that were not framed that we will be framing for the show. So that's where our framing budget is headed. So
How many pieces are in the show?
that is a great question. Maybe we're looking at probably like 70 or 80 because it's gonna be the Bison Gallery and the Changing Visions. So that's a big space. Some of these are, the Audubon's like this big, but some of them are this big. So, yeah.
And what process is used for, say, a painting that somebody makes prints of for sales in the house?
That'll depend on the artist. They can sort of pick that, whatever they think is going to be the best translation of their artistic vision for the painting. The Copley was a mezzotint. We have a lot of lithographs of paintings. That was pretty popular. Etchings, engravings of paintings also. So it depends on the time period, what's most popular, and who your audience is. Well, thank you. Thank you all.